Morocco is one of the oldest sovereign nations on Earth. The dynasty that rules it today, the Alawites, has held the throne in an unbroken line since the 1660s. Older than the United States, older than modern Germany, modern Italy. When the Ottomans swept west across North Africa, swallowing Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, they stopped at Morocco's eastern edge. They never took it. For more than 1,000 years, this corner of the continent governed itself. That is the first fact. Here is the second. For most of that 1,000 years, the King of Morocco did not rule Morocco. He ruled the cities. He ruled the plains around Fez, around Marrakesh, around Meknes, the fertile lowlands where a tax collector could ride out in the morning and be home by dark. Everywhere else paid him nothing. The mountains, the deserts, the high valleys, they obeyed him in nothing. His name was spoken in the Friday prayers, and his soldiers were turned back at the foot of the hills. When the French came, they gave these two countries names. The land the Sultan governed, they called Bled al-makhzen, the land of the storehouse, the land of government, where taxes were gathered and authority held. And the rest, the larger part, the part that answered to no one, they called Bled al-siba, the land of dissidence. Both were true at once. Morocco was among the most enduring kingdoms in the world, and it was barely a country at all. A throne older than most nations, sitting at the edge of a land that had never agreed to be ruled. So what exactly is Morocco? And how do you hold a kingdom together for 1,000 years, when most of it was never yours to hold? This is Morocco, the far northwest shoulder of Africa, where the continent reaches up toward Europe and stops just 9 miles short. It is a country built on edges. To the north, the Mediterranean. To the west, the Atlantic. To the south and east, the Sahara, the largest hot desert on the planet. And running down the middle of all of it, like a spine, the mountains. The Riff in the north, the Middle Atlas, and the High Atlas, rising past 4,000 meters, holding snow on its peaks for half the year, in a country the rest of the world pictures as sand. It was the mountains that made the paradox. A king on the plains could send an army up into a valley. He could not keep it there. The people of the heights knew every pass, every spring, every place a marching column could be trapped. They would melt into the rock, wait, and come back down when the soldiers had gone. You could win the battle in Bled al-siba. You could never win the land. Today, some 37 million people live inside that border. Most speak Arabic. Millions speak one of the mountain tongues. Many speak French, the language the colonizers left behind. They are farmers and fishermen, city clerks and shepherds, descendants of Amazigan and Arabs, of Andalusian refugees and Saharan traders and Jewish merchants, a people as layered as the land beneath them. To call all of them, across all that distance, a single nation is either the most natural thing in the world or the boldest. Perhaps both. To understand how a kingdom survives 1,000 years on terms like these, you have to begin where the kingdom was always strongest, in the city. Fez was already old when most of Europe's great cities were villages. It was founded in the year 789 by Idris I, a refugee prince descended from the prophet who crossed the desert to escape his enemies and built a capital on the banks of a small river. Within a century, it had become something the medieval world had almost nowhere else, a city of scholars. In the year 859, a woman named Fatima al-Fihri spent the entire fortune she had inherited from her father, a wealthy merchant, on a single project. She built a mosque, and around it, a place of teaching. It was called al-Qarawiyyin, and it has been teaching without a single year's interruption ever since. 1,200 years, students were studying law and astronomy and grammar in the courtyards of al-Qarawiyyin, while Viking longships still raided the coasts of England. They were studying there when the first European universities had not yet been imagined. They are studying there today. It is widely recognized as the longest continuously operating institution of higher learning anywhere in the world, and it was founded by a woman in a city in the heart of the land the Sultan controlled. This was Bled al-Makhzen at its finest. Fez was the brain of the kingdom. Its libraries held tens of thousands of manuscripts, its tanneries, its weavers, its metalworkers, its booksellers, all crowded into a Medina so dense and so old that to this day it remains one of the largest car-free urban spaces on Earth. A maze of 9,000 narrow lanes where a donkey is still the only vehicle that fits. In one corner of that maze, the work has not changed in 1,000 years. The tanneries of Fez are a honeycomb of stone vats open to the sky, where hides are still soaked and softened and dyed entirely by hand. First, in a pale mixture of lime and pigeon droppings to strip away the hair, then in pits of color drawn from saffron, poppy, indigo, mint, and pomegranate. Men stand waist-deep in the dye, treading the leather the way their ancestors did, in a process essentially unchanged since the Middle Ages. The smell carries for streets. The result is some of the finest leather in the world. Here, the makhzen made sense. Here was wealth that could be counted, taxed, defended. A merchant in Fez understood that his security came from the Sultan's law, and so he paid for it. The deal worked. The center held. But Fez was a single bright point in a vast and ungoverned country, and the further you traveled from its walls, the thinner the Sultan's authority became, until, somewhere out on the plains, it simply ran out. There is a place that shows just how old this division really is. Northwest of Fez, on a low hill above a sea of golden wheat, stand the ruins of a city called Volubilis. It was Roman. 2,000 years ago, this was the southwestern frontier of an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria. Volubilis had paved streets, marble columns, a triumphal arch, oil presses that pressed the wealth of the surrounding fields into amphorae bound for Rome. You can still walk its streets today. The mosaics are still on the floors. But here is the detail that matters. Rome held the plains around Volubilis, and Rome went no further. The legions never pushed into the mountains. The empire that conquered the known world drew its line at the edge of the lowlands and called everything beyond it barbarian country, unworth the cost of taking. The mosaics of Volubilis face out toward fields the empire owned, and behind them rise hills the empire never did. 2,000 years before the French invented the words bled al-makhzen and bled al-siba, the Romans had already lived the same arrangement. The plains could be ruled, the mountains could not. The paradox was older than the kingdom. It was written into the land itself. If Fez was the brain of the makhzen, then Marrakesh was its muscle. It rises out of the southern plain in a single color, a deep, sun-baked red, the color of the earth it was raised from, beneath the white wall of the high Atlas. The Almoravids built it in the 11th century, desert warriors who came up out of the Sahara on camels and founded a dynasty that would rule from Morocco all the way into Spain. After them came the Almohads, who tore much of it down and built it again, and raised over it the great minaret of the Kutubiyya Mosque, 70 meters of carved stone that has watched over the city for more than 800 years. And here lies one of the strangest turns in the whole story. The Almoravids and the Almohads, the dynasties that built Marrakesh, that raised the Kutubiyya, that carried Moroccan power across the sea into Spain and ruled an empire from the Atlantic to the deep desert, were not men of the cities. They were Imazighin. They came up out of the Sahara and down out of the mountains, out of the very land of dissidence the Makhzen could never hold. The Almoravids began as a movement among desert nomads in the far south, hardened by the Sahara, who swept north and founded a capital where none had stood. The Almohads rose a century later in the high Atlas itself, gathered around a stern mountain preacher named Ibn Tumat, and swept the Almoravids away in their turn. Time and again, the pattern repeated. The plains produced merchants and scholars, but the dynasties, the conquerors, the empire builders, the makers of the state, came out of the periphery. So the mountains and the deserts did not merely refuse to be ruled, they kept producing the rulers. The land of dissidence was forever overthrowing the land of government, and then becoming it, settling into the cities, growing soft on the plains until the next wave came down from the heights to do it all again. The paradox was not a flaw in the kingdom, it was the engine that drove it. Marrakesh was the capital that faced south. From here, the Sultan looked toward the desert and the trade that crossed it, and at its heart was a square called Jama el-Fna, a name that may mean the assembly of the dead, for it was once a place of public executions. By day, a market. By night, even now, a kind of living theater. Storytellers, musicians, snake charmers, the smoke of 100 food stalls rising into the dark. The performers in that square are practicing an oral tradition so old and so alive that the United Nations declared it a masterpiece of human heritage. But step out of Marrakesh in almost any direction, and within an hour, you are climbing. The Red City sits at the very threshold of Bled al-siba. Behind it, the mountains begin. And the people of those mountains were a different world entirely. They call themselves the Imazighin. It means roughly the free people. The world has long called them Berbers, a word that comes from the same root as barbarian, the name their conquerors gave them. But it is not the name they chose for themselves. They were here before the Arabs, before the Romans, before recorded history in this part of the world began. 10,000 years by some reckonings in these same mountains and valleys. Their language is not one language, but a family of them. Tamazight in the Middle Atlas, Tashelhit in the south, Tarifit in the north. Written, when it is written, in an alphabet called Tifinagh, whose angular letters look like the geometric symbols woven into their carpets. For most of Moroccan history, these were the languages of Bled al-siba, the languages the Makhzen did not speak, and it was in their world that the kingdom's authority dissolved. To climb into the high Atlas is to enter the country the Sultan never had. The valleys are terraced, narrow shelves of green, carved into slopes so steep they seem to defy the idea of farming at all. Walnut and almond trees cling to the watercourses. Villages of packed red earth, the same color as the mountainside, grow out of the rock so naturally they can be hard to see at all until you are among them. These are the douars, the hamlets of the heights. To survive on these slopes at all is a feat of engineering handed down across 100 generations. There is almost no flat ground, so the people made it, cutting the hillsides into terraces held by stone walls and feeding them through narrow channels called seguirs, dug along the contours of the mountain to carry snowmelt from a spring kilometers away to a barley field the size of a room. Every drop is accounted for. Whose water flows when and to which terrace is decided not by any official sent from the capital, but by the village itself. And that is the deepest reason the Makhzen never reached here. These communities did not need a state. They governed themselves through the Jama'ah, the assembly, the gathering of the heads of households, who met to settle disputes, divide the water, and decide for the village as a whole. A people who can feed themselves, defend their own passes, and resolve their own quarrels has very little use for a distant king who appears only to take a tax. The mountains were not lawless. They were governed, just not from Fez. You can read their history in their hands. The carpets the women of the Atlas weave are not simply decoration. The symbols knotted into the wool, the diamonds, the zigzags, the open eyes, carry meaning. A visual language of protection and fertility and belonging, passed from mother to daughter in a place where, for most of history, almost no one wrote anything down. Each region weaves its own signatures. A carpet from the Middle Atlas does not look like a carpet from the south. The land speaks, even in its wool. And once a year, the high country gathers. At the Mousem, the great seasonal festivals, families come down from scattered valleys to trade, to celebrate, to settle marriages. At one famous gathering in the High Atlas, young men and women have long come to meet and to choose one another in a festival of betrothal held where the valleys meet. The shepherds still move their flocks with the seasons, up to the high pastures in summer, down before the snow, a rhythm older than any border ever drawn on the land. The mountains keep their own calendar. They always have. Higher still are the cedar forests of the Middle Atlas, dark and cool and ancient, some of the trees more than 800 years old. And among them lives an animal that should not be here. The Barbary macaque, the only macaque, the only monkey of its kind anywhere in the world outside of Asia, and the only primate in all of Africa living north of the Sahara. A relic, a survivor of a wetter, greener age, holding on in the last cedar groves while the forest shrinks around it. The macaques and the cedars need each other. The monkeys feed on the seeds and the bark, and in moving through the canopy, they scatter and plant the next generation of trees. A forest that in places regrows itself by the work of an animal most of the world has never heard of. But the cedars are falling, cut for timber and for winter fuel, and the macaque is now endangered. A creature that survived the ice ages is struggling to survive us. At dawn in those forests, before the light reaches the valley floor, the spider webs strung between the cedar branches hold the night's mist in beads of water, thousands of tiny mirrors trembling in the first wind. It is a quiet kingdom, the forest. It keeps its own time. On the bare rock above the tree line lives the Aoudad, the Barbary sheep, moving across cliff faces so sheer they look impassable, dropping from ledge to ledge with a sureness that has kept it alive in terrain no army could ever hold. On the dry foothills below the rock, the The Cuvier's gazelle, pale, slender, and now rare, picks its way through the scrub, while high overhead, the eagles and vultures of the Atlas ride the rising air along the ridgelines, scanning a land that from their height shows no borders at all. And once, not long ago at all, the king of these mountains was the Barbary lion. Larger than its African cousins, with a dark mane that ran the length of its body, it ranged across the Atlas for thousands of years. The last confirmed wild Barbary lion was seen in the High Atlas around 1942. After that, silence. The mountains kept their freedom. They could not keep their lion. This was the world the al-makhzen looked at and could not take. Not because it lacked the will, because the mountains gave the people who lived in them something no sultan could match: the ability to disappear, to endure, to wait out any power that came for them. The tribes acknowledged the sultan as a religious figure, the commander of the faithful. They did not acknowledge him as a tax collector. The distinction was everything. And yet, there was one ruler who refused to accept it, who looked at the two Moroccos and decided, by sheer force of will, to make them one. His name was Moulay Ismail. He became sultan in 1672, and he ruled for 55 years, one of the longest reigns in the history of the country. He did not choose Fez for his capital or Marrakesh. He chose a third city, Meknes, and he set out to build there a seat of power so total that the whole kingdom would have to bend toward it. He raised walls 25 kilometers long. He built palaces, mosques, granaries, stables that could hold thousands of horses, vast underground vaults to store grain and water against any siege. Europeans who saw it called it the Versailles of Morocco, and he built much of it with the labor of tens of thousands of captives. Christian and Muslim alike worked without mercy. He was a contemporary of Louis XIV of France, and he dealt with the Sun King almost as an equal, exchanging letters and embassies, and, by one famous account, even asking for the hand of a French princess. His court was a place of legendary splendor and legendary terror in equal measure, where foreign ambassadors marveled at the scale of his ambition and trembled at his temper. He meant to build a Morocco that would answer to one man in one city forever. To enforce his will across the land, Moulay Ismail did something no Moroccan ruler had done before. He built an army that owed nothing to any tribe. He assembled a standing force of black soldiers, the Abid al-Bukhari, bound to the Sultan alone, loyal to him, dependent on him, with no clan or valley to flee back to. With them, he marched into the country that had never paid. He broke rebellions, he garrisoned the passes, he pushed the line of the al-makhzen further than it had ever gone. In 1727, Moulay Ismail died. He left behind a fortress capital, an empire briefly held by force, and, by some accounts, hundreds of children. And almost the moment he was gone, the tribes he had subdued rose again, the garrisons withdrew, and the line of government slid back down toward the plains. He had proven the thing could be done. He had also proven it could not be made to last. The country he had hammered into one shape sprang back into two the instant the hammer was lifted. The reach of the al-makhzen was never about the strength of the king alone. It was about geography. And nowhere is the geography more absolute than in the south, where the mountains finally give way and the land turns to sand. Beyond the High Atlas lies the Moroccan Sahara, and the way down into it is one of the great descents on Earth. The road drops through gorges where rivers have cut walls hundreds of meters high, through the Todra and the Dades, past valleys where the date palms run in a green ribbon along the water and the desert presses in on both sides. The Dra, Morocco's longest river, threads south through this country until, in most years, it vanishes into the sand before it ever reaches the sea. Out here stand the Kasbahs, fortified earthen castles, towers of mud and straw rising from the desert floor, their walls decorated with patterns pressed into the clay. The greatest of them, Ait Ben Haddou, has guarded the old caravan route for centuries. You have almost certainly seen it, because the world's filmmakers have used it as a stand-in for ancient cities across half the planet. And further on, the dunes themselves, Erg Chebi near Merzouga, ridges of fine orange sand rising as high as 150 meters, shifting, singing in the wind. This was the edge of the kingdom, and it was also its source. The Alawite dynasty, the family that rules Morocco to this day, did not come from Fez or Marrakesh. It came from here, from the oasis region of Tafilaut, on the rim of the desert. And nearby, once stood the city of Sijil Massa, the great gateway of the Sahara trade, where caravans arrived from the south carrying gold, salt, and people, and turned the desert's edge into one of the richest crossroads in the medieval world. The trade that built Sijil Massa ran on a single, improbable exchange. Out of the forests, far to the south, came gold, so much of it that West African kingdoms grew legendary for their wealth. And the thing those kingdoms wanted in return, the thing worth crossing the deadliest desert on earth to obtain, was salt, cut in great slabs from mines in the middle of the Sahara, loaded onto camels and carried south. In some markets, gold was traded for salt by weight, ounce for ounce. A single caravan might number in the thousands of camels. The crossing could take 2 months, and men and animals died on the way. But the profit was a king's ransom, and for centuries the sultans of Morocco grew rich not from the desert, but from the road across it. The desert has its own survivors. The fennec fox, smallest of all the world's foxes, with ears so large they radiate away the heat of the day and catch the smallest sound of prey moving beneath the sand. It can live, if it must, without ever drinking, drawing the water it needs from what it eats. On the stony margins, the dark beetles wait out the furnace of noon, buried in the cooler sand below, emerging in the gentler hours to feed. Every living thing here is an answer to the same question. How do you persist where almost nothing can? It is the question the whole country seems to be asking, and the people of the desert and the mountains answered it the same way for 1,000 years, by belonging to themselves. But not all of Morocco's edges were walls. Some were doorways. On the Atlantic coast stands Essaouira, a city of white walls and blue shutters and wind. So much wind that it has become a haven for surfers, though for most of its history, the wind meant something else. It meant trade. The Portuguese built ramparts here. Merchants from across the world passed through, and for generations, Essaouira was home to one of the most important Jewish communities in Morocco, living in the Mellah, the Jewish quarter, woven into the commerce and the music and the daily life of the town. This was always part of the country's truth, and it is easy to forget. Morocco was never only Arab and Berber and Muslim. It was Jewish too. For 2,000 years, one of the oldest and largest Jewish communities in the Arab world, merchants and craftsmen and scholars whose presence shaped the cities. Most are gone now, departed across the second half of the 20th century. But the synagogues remain, and the cemeteries and the memory, tended carefully even where the community itself has thinned almost to nothing. Inland from that coast, where the Riff Mountains begin to climb, sits a town the color of the sky. Chefchaouen, its old quarter washed entirely in shades of blue, wall after wall, stair after stair, a single hue rising up the mountainside. The custom may have been brought by Jewish refugees who settled here centuries ago. It may be older still. The town began as a fortress, a place of refuge from foreign invasion, and for a long time, outsiders were forbidden to enter at all. It sits in the foothills of the Jabala country, the doorway to the Riff, the threshold of the most defiant land in all of Morocco. North of the cities, the coast bends toward the place where Morocco comes closest to Europe. And here, the kingdom's story turns from a question of mountains into a question of empires. Tangier sits at the very mouth of the Mediterranean, where the sea narrows to the Strait of Gibraltar and the two continents nearly touch. For most of the 20th century, it was not quite part of any country at all, an international zone governed jointly by a committee of foreign powers, a city of spies and smugglers and exiled writers, where the rules of the rest of the world did not seem to apply. For decades, it answered to no single flag. An international zone run by a committee of foreign powers, Tangier became a city of contradictions. Banks and backrooms, diplomats and smugglers, artists and outlaws, a free port where currencies and secrets changed hands, and the ordinary rules seemed suspended at the water's edge. It drew people from across the world precisely because it belonged to everyone and to no one. Even here, at the kingdom's northern doorway, Morocco managed to be more than one thing at once. Tangier was the threshold, and in the early 20th century, it was through thresholds like this one that the outside world finally found a way to do what no one had managed in 1,000 years, to take Morocco whole. In 1912, the kingdom that had outlasted the Romans and the Ottomans was carved in two by the stroke of a pen. France took the larger share, the cities, the fertile plains, the heart of Bled al-Makhzen, and ruled it as a protectorate. Spain took the north, including the Riff Mountains and a strip of the deep south. The Sultan stayed on his throne, but the throne now answered to Paris. The first French resident general was a soldier named Hubert Lyautey, and he understood Morocco better than most of those who came after him. He saw the old division between the governed land and the ungoverned land, and rather than erase it, he made it policy. The Makhzen regions and the al-siba regions would be administered differently, the tribal areas through their own customary law, kept apart from the Arabic-speaking cities. Critics called it what it was: divide and rule. And even with two empires, with tanks and aircraft, the conquest took a generation. The French signed their treaty in 1912, but the mountains did not fall with the cities. Tribe by tribe, valley by valley, the colonial armies fought their way into the High Atlas and the Anti-Atlas through the 1920s and into the 1930s. The last independent strongholds in the southern mountains were not subdued until 1934. Consider what that means. France called Morocco a possession from 1912, but it did not actually finish conquering the land for another 22 years. The whole of unified, fully governed Morocco, The country that exists on every modern map had been complete for barely 2 decades before the empire that finished it began to fall apart, and independence arrived in 1956. The single Morocco is younger than it looks, far younger. But there was one part of Bled al-siba that would not be divided and would not be ruled. It was the part the Spanish had taken. It was the Riff. The Riff is a wall of mountains along the Mediterranean coast in the far north, steep, poor, proud, and home to some of the most independent people in a land defined by independence. They had never bowed to the Sultan in Fez. They had no intention of bowing to a general in Madrid. And in the early 1920s, they found a leader. His name was Mohammed bin Abdelkrim el-Khattabi, known to history simply as Abdelkrim. He was born in the Riff around 1882, the son of a respected local judge. He was not a wild tribesman. He had studied at al-Qarawiyyin in Fez, the ancient university of the Makhzen. He had worked as a teacher, a journalist, a judge himself, even for a time within the Spanish colonial administration. He understood the modern world, and he turned that understanding against it. What Abdelkrim did next had never truly been done in Moroccan history. He took the fractured, feuding tribes of the Riff, clans that had spent generations fighting one another as readily as any outsider, and he bound them into a single force, under a single command, fighting for a single idea. August 1921. A Spanish army of more than 20,000 men advances into the Riff, confident, contemptuous, certain that mountain tribesmen cannot stand against a modern European force. Near a place called Annual, Abd el-Krim's fighters fall on them. What follows is not a defeat. It is an annihilation. The Spanish line collapses. The retreat becomes a rout. The rout becomes a slaughter. Men cut down in their thousands as they flee across the open ground. By the time it ends, more than 13,000 Spanish soldiers are dead. It is one of the worst disasters ever suffered by a European army at the hands of a colonized people. And it shakes Spain so badly that it helps bring down the government in Madrid. And now, Abdelkrim does the thing the whole of Moroccan history had been building toward and recoiling from. In the mountains, in the land of dissidence, he declares a state, the Republic of the Riff. It has a flag, it has an administration, a system of taxes, a court, an army numbering in the tens of thousands. The land that had refused to be a country for 1,000 years had, at last, decided to become one, on its own terms, by its own hand, answering to no sultan and no empire at all. This was no improvised revolt. Abd el-Krim built the apparatus of a real state in the heart of the mountains, a capital at Ajdir, a treasury, courts that applied a single law across tribes that had never shared one, even negotiations with foreign companies over the Riff's iron ore. He gave interviews to European journalists who trekked into the hills to meet the man who had humbled an empire. For a brief moment in the 1920s, the world watched the Republic of Mountain Villages and wondered whether the age of European empire might end, not in Europe, but here, on a ridge above the Mediterranean. For a few years it held. Abdelkrim's forces pushed south, defeating the Spanish again and again, advancing until they threatened Fez itself, the ancient capital, the heart of the Makhzen, now within reach of a republic born in the hills. The colonial powers looked at the Riff and understood finally that bled al-siba was not a backward remnant to be managed. It was an idea that could win. So they decided to destroy it. France, watching its own protectorate threatened, joined the war on Spain's side. Together, they assembled a force of around 500,000 men, with tanks, with artillery, with aircraft. Against them stood a republic of mountain villages. And then, the empires reached for a weapon that should never have been used at all. Beginning in the mid-1920s, the Spanish military bombed the Riff with poison gas. Mustard gas, chiefly, manufactured in Germany in violation of the treaties meant to ban it, and shipped to Spain through a chemist who had worked on Germany's own gas program in the First World War. It was, by most accounts, one of the first times an aerial chemical campaign was waged so widely against a civilian population. They did not aim only at fighters. The strategy, drawn from the archives by later historians, was to target the places where people gathered: the markets, the villages, the wells. Mustard gas burns the skin, blinds the eyes, scars the lungs of anyone who breathes it. It settles into the soil and the water and lingers for years. It does not distinguish between a soldier and a child. That was the point. Decades later, researchers would point to unusually high rates of certain cancers in the Riff and ask whether the gas had ever truly left, whether a war fought in the 1920s was still, quietly, taking the lives of people born long after it had ended. The Republic of the Riff could fight an army. It could not fight the air itself. In May 1926, surrounded, gassed, outnumbered 10-1, Abd el-Krim surrendered. To the French, not the Spanish, in the hope of mercy. The Republic was dissolved. He was sent into exile on a distant island and later to Cairo, where he lived out his years and died in 1963, having watched from afar as one African country after another won the independence he had reached for first. Let that sit for a moment. The single most determined attempt in 1,000 years to turn Bled al-Siba into a nation of its own was not defeated by the Sultan. It was not defeated by the geography that had protected it for so long. It was defeated by poison dropped from the sky by two of the most powerful empires on Earth, and the wounds it left in the soil of the Riff are spoken of in those mountains to this day. The end of the protectorate came through the throne itself. In 1953, the French, frustrated by a sultan who had begun to back the independence movement, deposed Mohammed V and sent him and his family into exile, far away on the island of Madagascar. They installed a compliant relative in his place. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The exiled sultan became overnight the symbol of the whole nation. People claimed to see his face in the face of the moon. Resistance hardened across every region, city, and mountain alike. Within 2 years, the French gave up, brought Mohammed V home to a delirious welcome, and in 1956, Morocco was sovereign once more. The monarchy had done the one thing the Makhzen had never quite managed in 1,000 years. It had made itself the symbol of the entire country, plains and peaks together, at the very moment that country was, for the first time, about to become real. When Morocco finally won its independence in 1956, the Makhzen returned, and this time, for the first time in its history, it returned over the whole map. The line between the governed land and the ungoverned land was, on paper, erased. The kingdom that had never been one country was suddenly asked to become one. It has spent every year since trying. The monarchy modernized, built roads into valleys that had never seen them, ran power lines and schools up into the heights. The Alawite dynasty, the same family that had come up out of the desert at Tafilaut 3.5 centuries before, remained on the throne. Muhammad VI, the current king, the 23rd of his line. Few dynasties anywhere have lasted so long. You can see the modern face of the Makhzen most clearly on the Atlantic coast, in a city that barely existed 2 centuries ago. Casablanca is now the largest city in Morocco and one of the great economic engines of Africa. A sprawl of high-rises and port cranes and traffic, home to more than 3 million people, the place the young of the mountains and the south come looking for work. On its shore stands the Hassan II Mosque, finished in 1993, among the largest mosques in the world, its minaret rising more than 200 meters above the sea. Much of it was built out over the water itself, so that the faithful kneel above the Atlantic. And the capital is not Fez or Marrakesh or Meknes, the old imperial cities, but Rabat on the coast, chosen by the French and kept by the kingdom. A quieter city of ministries and walled gardens, where an unfinished tower from the 12th century, the Hassan Tower, still stands beside the white mausoleum of the kings. The center of gravity has moved to the sea. The mountains are roaded and wired and schooled as never before in their history. And slowly, the old wound of the two Moroccos began in places to close. For decades, the state had pushed Arabic and pushed the mountain languages to the margins. Children were once mocked for speaking Tamazight in school. But in 2011, that language, the language of bled al-siba, the tongue of the free people, was written into the constitution as an official language of the kingdom, alongside Arabic. The Amazigh New Year was made a national holiday. The land of dissidence, after 1,000 years, was being woven into the idea of the nation rather than ruled against it. And yet the geography has not changed. The mountains are still the mountains, and every so often the country is reminded that the line it drew on the map was never quite the same as the line on the ground. The 8th of September, 2023, 11 minutes past 11 at night. Deep beneath the high Atlas, southwest of Marrakesh, 2 slabs of the Earth's crust slip past each other, and the mountains shudder with a force of magnitude 6.8. It is the strongest earthquake to strike this part of Morocco in living memory. The cities take damage, but it is the douars, the small earthen villages of the heights, the same hamlets that have clung to these slopes for centuries, that are destroyed. Houses of packed mud and stone, built the way they have always been built, fold in on themselves and bury the people inside. Nearly 3,000 are killed. Whole villages, perched in the high valleys, are flattened in seconds. And then comes the part of the story that the whole of Moroccan history seems to echo. The hardest hit places are the hardest to reach. The roads are narrow, broken, blocked by landslides. The villages worst affected sit highest, deepest, furthest from the cities, in exactly the country the Makhzen could never quite hold. Survivors wait days for help to climb to them. Some bury their own dead before any aid arrives at all. More than a year later, many were still living in tents through the mountain winter, the reconstruction slow, the promised support late. The state reached for its highest valleys the way the state had always reached for them, with effort, with distance, with the same old gap between the center and the heights that 1,000 years had never fully closed. And the young of those villages now face the oldest choice in the country, sharpened to a point. Stay in the mountains and rebuild the home of their grandparents, stone by stone, in a place the work has nearly run out, or leave for Casablanca, for Marrakesh, for the cities of the plain, and send money back up the valley to families left behind. It is the same pull that has drawn the mountains toward the cities and held them apart from the cities for as long as there have been mountains and cities here. The earthquake did not create that distance. It only revealed, in a single night, how far it still runs. So we come back to where we began. Is Morocco one country? On the map, yes. There is a flag, a king, a border, a parliament, a single name. By that measure, Morocco is one of the oldest and most continuous states on the face of the earth, and that is no small thing. Most of the nations around it were drawn by foreigners in the last 100 years. Morocco drew itself across more than 1,000. But ask the question a different way. Ask whether the people of the high valleys and the people of the imperial cities have ever truly belonged to a single thing. Whether the land of government and the land of dissidence ever fully became one. And the honest answer is more complicated. The kingdom is 1,000 years old. The country, the unified country that reaches all the way into the mountains, is younger than many of the people living in it. Perhaps that is the truth Morocco has to teach. That a nation is not a fact you inherit, fixed and finished. It is an argument that never quite ends. Between the center and the edge, the plain and the peak, the power that wants to count everyone, and the people who would rather not be counted. Morocco has been having that argument for 1,000 years. It is having it still, in the tents of the high Atlas, under the snow. No one knows how the argument ends, or whether it is meant to end at all. Maybe the holding together is the whole achievement. A throne that lasted because it learned in the end not to demand everything. A country that survived by being, quietly, more than one. Thank you for traveling with us, all the way to the edge of the map and back. Until the next journey.